Welcome to, I think this is the fifth episode of Spilled Ink. I feel like I've been going through and just reaching out to people I've known for more than a decade. Anyone who has now more information on prep sports than I did when I left the Times, as I try to kind of reconnect. And no one knows more about high school football in the area than Brandon Huffman. Brandon, thanks for joining me.
Hey, Mason, it's like the early 2010s up in here right now.
I will say, I do owe you, I think, a thank you because I had a very short run at ESPN covering recruiting, and it was definitely not what I was meant for. But you were very helpful in at least making it tolerable for the year that I did it. I think I'm more on the side of telling kids stories and not, doing the sort of the analysis and where are you going to go to school. So I appreciate that I can rely on you for that now.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's funny because the way recruiting was covered when, that year you were in it has changed so vastly, which is kind of a microcosm of where recruiting in general in the sport and where college football has gone. So, you're not missing much, I could say, except then you're also missing, it seems like everything because everything is so different.
Mhm. What is, I mean, obviously that's sort of it's easy question because it's everything, but
Mhm.
what is the sort of the biggest thing that's changed? I hear that coaches aren't going to schools as much anymore. It's more the portal. What is it, and this is more for, I guess, a kid maybe getting ready to go through this process. What's the biggest change that like they can expect to see now?
Yeah, I mean, you just kind of said it. It's been pretty fascinating. This past week was the opening of the contact period. And, in years past, you would have the February signing day. The first Wednesday in February was National Signing Day. Well, over the last 6, 7 years, you have the early signing period in December, and that was the third Wednesday in December. Now that's the first Wednesday in December. And there were so many rules around contacting juniors to now this last week, you're seeing coaches on the road doing in-home visits with juniors, whereas that used to not be until December of your senior year. And that's just kind of par for the course where the whole recruiting calendar has changed with the early signing period. The amount of guys, I mean, you remember because you were covering it back there when Max Brown announced for USC and enrolled early right after the All American Bowl. That was still kind of a rare thing. Now, everybody, not just the quarterbacks, everybody's enrolling in January, and many are enrolling in December. And so the calendar has changed everything. And you've got NIL, you've got the transfer portal, you have unlimited transfers, you have no longer needing to sit out a year after you transfer. You have schools that are now going from 120 guys on the roster to 105, 85 on scholarship. There's been a misconception that there's no more walk-ons. There still are walk-ons. There absolutely are walk-ons. Schools can scholarship up to 105, but they're only going to scholarship 85. And because of that, with the portal, high school guys are getting recruited less by the FBS schools, but they're getting more attention from the FCS schools. So much has changed really since July 1st, 2021, which is the day that NIL was officially allowed. And we've seen about 50 years worth of recruiting changes in the last 4 years.
That's nuts. Yeah, I mean, I think about it, and it's really been eye-opening for me. And I think the one thing, for example, I spent some time around Eastside Catholic this year. They had some really good kids. And the story that I kept hearing is, yeah, these kids who may have gone higher level D1 are now going to have to start FCS, right? And I think that that seems sort of par for the course. For example, a guy like Austin Harnito at
Mm-hmm.
Washington, right, walks on, transfers to Nevada. And I'm so happy for these kids that they're having the opportunity to get some money. I'm really curious about what that does. Like, does it have to be so much more now a business decision as opposed to where I want to go play?
I mean, yeah, it really is a business decision now. You're seeing guys use the FCS almost as like a junior college in the old days, where you go there, you prove yourself, you get tape, you get production. And one thing we've heard from college coaches this cycle is production over projection, where high school recruiting is a lot of times predicated on projecting a player. What's he going to look like in 4 or 5 years from now, rather than what's he going to look like as a true freshman, is now, hey, we don't have time to develop a guy. So we'll let him go to an FCS school. We'll let him go to a Big Sky school and get production, get playing time, get film, and then we'll go recruit him. And now those FCS coaches know going in, we get this guy for 2 years, 3 years. That's great because if he becomes as good of a player as we think he is, we're probably going to lose him. But then we're going to be able to recruit above our weight. And now with schools going maybe 70-30, 60-40 portal or high school to portal, that means those FCS schools and Division II schools are getting a better caliber player than they were 5 years ago, 7 years ago, but they may only hold on to them for a couple of years. And, Isaiah Fonse a couple of years ago is kind of one of the first guys that went to Montana State, helped him to the national championship game, ends up going to the portal, goes to Cal. This year in the state of Washington alone, and that year you had Xavier Guillory do the same thing, goes to Idaho State, ends up becoming a key starter on Arizona State's team that makes the playoffs. Trey Weed leaves Eastern Washington, goes to Nevada and flourishes. Then you have guys like Efton Chisholm who go to Eastern Washington. Schools are actively trying to get him to go into the portal. The Monroe grad decides to stay at Eastern Washington and break just about every imaginable record. And his business decision was, I'm going to stay here and break records rather than go to Eastern for a couple of years and then work my way up. And, every decision comes with a consequence, whether it's a good consequence or a bad consequence. But Efton Chisholm's going to leave as a record holder, and he's going to get into, he's probably going to get drafted and get into a camp. And that loyalty is going to be something that coaches are going to love. But that doesn't mean that those guys that left their school for another school, from an FCS to an FBS, weren't loyal. They also bet on themselves. And so you're seeing that it is predicated on a business decision. And the downside of that is the academic side of it does not become as much of a factor in the decision-making process.
Is that just, and when you look at that, is it in your mind good, bad, or just is?
It just is, and I'll use another great example. Will Reed, who played at Eastside Catholic, was on the 2021 team with JT Tuimoloau, who, stayed 4 years at Ohio State, probably going to be a first rounder. Will Reed was committed to Cal for the majority of his recruitment. At the last minute, decides I cannot pass up on the Ivy League. So he ends up flipping his commitment from Cal to Princeton, goes to Princeton as a 3-year starter. He's going to graduate from Princeton in May, but he goes in the portal because the Ivy League doesn't allow for red shirts. He's going to leave Princeton with the Princeton degree, and now he's going to be able to go. And he's got a number of schools: Virginia, Georgia Tech, Arizona, West Virginia, Arizona State, Pitt, Nebraska, all recruiting him. And he's going to leave with the degree from Princeton. Now, a lot of these guys are going to leave without a degree because they're bouncing around from school to school, but they're making a business decision themselves. I got to put myself in the best position from an NIL standpoint and from an NFL standpoint. And other guys were like, hey, I'm going to use this experience to get that degree so I can set my next 50, 60 years of my life.
So really, it sounds like it's just putting some big decisions on an 18-year-old kid. Whereas, before you're good, oh, I'm just gonna, I love the school. I've always loved the school. I'm gonna go there. And now it's sort of like, no, you need to have this mapped out a little bit more.
Yeah, and that's because again the recruiting calendar has changed so much. Where when Max announced his decision in April of his junior year, nowadays most quarterbacks are making decisions in the spring of their sophomore year. The schedule has moved everybody up. Faison Brandon, who was the number one player in the country in 2026, announced in August or in September, wanted to announce in December of his junior year, but schools were like, hey, you know what? We need to have a decision from you. You're the number one player in the country, but we got to make a decision here soon what we're going to do at quarterback. So can you commit earlier? Even the top players are kind of forced to move theirs up. So you have to have a plan in place much earlier, whereas the old day, it was really get recruited your junior year, have a big senior year. If you're really elite, you might get some offers as a sophomore. Now, by the end of your sophomore year, you better start worrying about whittling those schools down because there may not be a spot to commit to if you don't commit earlier. So your plan has to be accelerated by almost a year.
Mhm. Um, and with that in mind, I think a pretty good example that locally folks would know about is, and I didn't get to chance to watch him play, but watching Sam Heward's career, right? Like he's really had to do some navigating, as a college quarterback.
And the thing with Sam is the circumstances that kind of worked against him. He goes to University of Washington expecting to play for Jimmy Lake. They redshirt him because you got another local kid in Dylan Morris, who's the starter. And Sam starts one game, has a miserable game. Then Kalen DeBoer comes in and brings his former quarterback at Indiana and Michael Penix. So I think Husky fans will make that trade every time. Sam stays, but then decides to leave when it becomes clear Penix is coming back. Makes the move to Cal Poly to go play for his high school coach. lights it up there, goes to Utah, and then has an injury all year that keeps him from the field. Now he's going to USC to play. Could he be the guy at USC? But this was a career that 4 years ago, when he left East or when he left Kennedy Catholic as the state's all-time leading passer, you thought he'll be at University of Washington for 3 years and he's off to the NFL. Well, a lot of the quarterbacks that we expect to be the guy, that 21 class is going to be there's going to be a 30 for 30 someday about that 2021 class, because so many of those guys missed the entire year of football. A lot of them just skipped their senior year to go enroll because football was canceled in their state. Sam, I think, played 3 games that year. Then you have the coaching changes and the coaching circumstances. And so there's so many things that are out of your control a lot of times that end up kind of not delaying the path, but sometimes derailing the plan that you had, and the plan that I think everybody else thought was going to just be a matter of time. It was going to be a matter of when, not if Sam got drafted. Now he's looking for a place to define himself. And, to his credit, he's had a good head about it this entire time. But 4 years ago, I don't think anybody in the world would have expected him to be heading to his fourth school. We thought he would have been, 4 years would have been tops how long he was in college before he was off to the league.
Hmm. I mean, I think if you go back to when I was covering recruiting, the same thing, Max Brown, Christian Hackenberg, all those
Mhm.
guys.
Yeah, and you look back to that era, and you look to a Christian Hackenberg. I mean, would things have been different if he didn't go to Penn State? Where our Bill O'Brien doesn't leave after his second year, and does Max Brown, are things different at USC if Lane Kiffin doesn't get fired? His freshman year. I mean, there's so many things that were out of those guys' control. Remember when Hackenberg picked Penn State, it was because Bill O'Brien was trying to resurrect that program, and he does, but then he leaves after Christian Hackenberg's first year. When Max Brown picks USC, they're coming off a 10-win season where they didn't get to go to a bowl, but Matt Barkley's the Heisman Trophy frontrunner. Naturally, he's going to hand it over. Then Clay Helton, or I'm sorry, Lane Kiffin gets fired in the middle of the year, and then Steve Sarkisian comes in, and they're just, when those guys made the commitments, they didn't expect all these changes to happen. And you look at a school like Washington, where Dylan Morris commits to Chris Peterson, where Sam Heward, when he committed in I think it was November of his sophomore year, he commits to Chris Peterson. Well, then Chris Peterson retires a year later. He never gets the chance to play for Chris Peterson. Dylan Morris never gets the chance to play for Chris Peterson. Would their careers have been vastly different if Chris Peterson's still the head coach, if Bush Hamden's still the offensive coordinator? And that's the thing. When they made that pick, you think they're making the safest, most secure decision in the world, and then things out of their control. The coach they commit to leaves, and it ends up being a mad scramble to find, how do I salvage my career at this point?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess that really is the the challenge, right? Like if you're going to play for a coach, the coaches could be gone just as fast as, and now I guess it's the whole thing, right? Like where it was
Hmm.
like you have to worry about the coach going, now it's the coaches and the players, and I mean really like a kind of a true free agency NFL, moving closer to model.
And that's really the thing that's going on now, is like, you could be recruited by a school and they're telling you, hey, you're the only guy we're bringing in. Then they leave out the part that, but we're also bringing in somebody out of the portal. So with, again, this goes back to the recruiting calendar change, where signing day used to be that third Wednesday in December. Now signing day is the first Wednesday in December, and the portal doesn't open afterwards. So guys are signing that first week, and then a week later, they're finding out that the school that they signed with is taking a couple transfers, or a school that they may have wanted to go to is losing a couple quarterbacks to the portal. So you're committing to a school, then you're signing with the school, and then their entire roster changes 5 days after you put your pen to paper. And with assistant coaching changes, with head coaching changes, the one caveat to that is, for the first time ever, the players have the power. They're no longer signing national letters of intent; they're signing financial aid agreements. So where the NLI bound the player more than the school, now the financial aid agreements bound the school more than the player. So they're getting more freedom, but you may have had those plans, and those best laid plans end up going to the wayside.
Mhm.
And so that is why the NCAA finally just put their hands up, because the courts kept saying, well, you guys are kind of screwing these kids. And now they were giving them the ability to transfer without sitting out a year, the ability to transfer unlimited amount of times, because for so long, the schools were controlling the players. Now the players have more control. So when things that are out of their control, they can at least kind of counter that.
Hmm. Yeah, and at least make an attempt to get things back on track.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting. The biggest reason why I wanted to have you on, I could talk about this stuff all day long.
Oh, it's fascinating theater.
Yeah, you have such good insight there. As far as actual players in Washington, we finished up the 2024 season and everybody's already turning the page. In your mind, who are five kids that people should be paying attention heading into next season?
It's funny because when you look at the state of Washington historically, some of the best talented players from this state have been on the defensive side of the ball. And then for a good stretch of time, it looked like this state was all about offense. And if you were watching the Rose Bowl, the Ohio State Oregon game last week, you saw a nice combination of, the left tackle being the former number one player in the state from Seattle, from Rainier Beach, from the Metro League. And the defensive end for Ohio State, he was a Metro League guy, but then Emeka Egbuka, G. Scott with the first catch of the game, two other pass catchers from the state. Well, 2025 was, kind of a weird recruiting class. A couple of guys on offense, a couple of guys on defense, but 2026. It is a defensive heavy class. The top three players in the state are all edge rushers. Four of the top five players in the state, in fact, five of the top six players in the state are all defensive players. You've got Derek Coleman Brusa, who's pretty much the unanimous number one player in the state out of Kennedy Catholic, a just a dynamic, explosive edge rusher. His brother Lowen just signed with Washington in December. Derek's top three schools are essentially Washington, the hometown school, and then those two teams we just talked about in the Rose Bowl, Oregon and Ohio State. You've got David Schwarzel at O'Dea, who was a key part for O'Dea State Championship this season, their first one in 7 years. He can play inside as a three tech. He can be outside as an edge rusher. He's the number two player in the state. And then Fa'az Siale, who lines up next to Schwarzel at O'Dea. Again, another big part of that O'Dea State Championship team. Another guy that could play as a three tech, could be an edge rusher. He's the number three player in the state. And then the number five player, Wasi Lugalobi out of Eastside Catholic, already committed to Washington. A true linebacker, but a guy that can be an edge rusher. And then just behind him, out of Tacoma, Elijah Dirk from Mount Tahoma High School. And then there's one offensive player in that top six, and you got to go down to Vancouver. Terrence Sarion out of Evergreen High School in Vancouver. It was an Oregon-Washington battle for him. And in Vancouver, you're kind of in no man's land. You could be a Duck fan, you could be a Husky fan. He chose the Huskies over the Ducks, so I'm sure that went over really well on social media and the social channels because those two fan bases really get along
Yeah, oh
when it
yeah,
comes to it. But
absolutely.
we're seeing that defensive side of the ball in the state really becoming kind of the focus in 2026. And Eastside Catholic and Kennedy Catholic and O'Dea are kind of hoarding that defensive talent. But then you've got Mount Tahoma. Keith Terry, shout out, great job he's done there at Mount Tahoma. Had a player signed last year at UCLA, Marquise Thorpe Taylor. Now he's got Elijah Durr, who's the top non-lineman, non-front seven guy in the state in 2026.
Is there a under the radar guy that you've seen that really, people that might jump onto people's radar?
Okay, I'm gonna cheat a little bit here because it's hard to call a guy who was a state champion an under the radar player, but when you hear the name Banchero, you think basketball, you think Apollo. But his brother Julio had the Hail Mary catch that won the game for O'Dea against Eastside Catholic in the semifinals. He's making his mark on the football field. And he's kind of an under the radar name because, the basketball background, but he'd be a name to keep an eye on. But then I'm going to do kind of a true under the radar. And there's a kid out of Kashmir, Prin Fox. You don't necessarily think Kashmir. You don't necessarily think, we're Division One football players. But Prin Fox is a defensive lineman, speaking again to that defensive theme, kind of overlooked a little bit because he's playing in Kashmir, but a monstrous defensive lineman. Boise State's after him, Oregon State, Washington State after him. But I have a feeling that after January and March, when coaches get on the road or when the coach is allowed to have these guys come back to campus, you could see his recruitment really take off. And I mean, in the state of Washington this year, you got the Brady and Brock Beener both going to Montana. You have Colton Lance from Nooksack Valley going to Montana. You have Carter Kukenbook from Okanagan going to Boise State. A lot of these towns, the Beener brothers are both from Anacortes. So a lot of players coming from the non-traditional cities and non-traditional powers. And I think Prin Fox would be that one name in 2026 who's kind of off the beaten path that's going to end up signing with an FBS school.
Okay. Yeah, that's awesome. I think that's, I love this because I've been so out of it for so long that it's cool to catch up on that. Well, I'm blanking on his name, but there's the kid, and this is future tripping a little bit, but the
Mhm.
freshman defensive end for Eastside Catholic seems like he could be a monster.
Yeah, there's in fact, there's two or three freshmen at Eastside Catholic that are names for everybody to know. Titan McNeil is one of them. He's
Yes.
a tight end, hooper, and was from Idaho. He's a basketball player, but he's got some offers at the tight end. And then you got Aiden Havili, who's the defensive lineman at Eastside Catholic, who was also a freshman, already have FBS offers. So it's just good to see Eastside Catholic, finally getting some young talent to come in there and make an impact as early on in their career.
Yeah, no, it was actually I really liked watching that team. I think, my favorite player that I saw all year was Jeremiah Burrows.
Hmm.
I think a kid that really you could tell how much he cared and got the most out of his size. What was your impression of just football in the state this year?
It was pretty fun to watch because there had been years where there was such an obvious top team that you thought that top team wasn't a matter of if they won the state championship, it was going to be how convincingly they won it. And I think back to the 2021 Graham Kapowsin team that we got to see that spring of 2021 in that shortened season, and they were pretty dominant that year. Outside of a game they had to rally to beat Puyallup, they ended up being just dominant that fall, going and beat Collins Hill in the ESPN game where Josh Wood throws a touchdown in the final seconds. In the last couple of years, you saw a Yelm team that was really dominant. We've seen, Bellevue teams that were super dominant. And then this year you had Bellevue, the defending state champions. You had Lake Stevens, the defending state champions, both returning a ton of talent. And you leave with O'Day winning that first state title in 7 years. You leave with Sumner, who had been on the cusp and so close in several years under Keith Ross and losing in the semifinals in heartbreaking fashion to a team from Vancouver, or injuries derailing a team as they got to the semifinals. Well, this year they rallied to beat Camas in the state championship game. And I think, the entire city of Sumner was at Husky Stadium that night, but it was like, that was, the Keith Ross had finally got them across the hump. And that's what was great about this year is, yeah, you saw Anacortes win their second state title over Tumwater, who we've seen in that championship game a number of years. We saw Bellevue in the state championship game for a number of years, but it was like O'Day. How many state titles would O'Day have if they never had to play Bellevue in the playoffs? And Monty Kohler finally got that elusive win over Bellevue in the postseason. And then you see a Sumner, and then you have even teams in like 2B having Division One prospects. And so what I think has been great, and it's kind of similar to how college football is going, it's not just the haves, the traditional have-nots or the schools that haven't quite been in that blue blood mentality are now having a chance to win. And you're seeing a little bit more parity. And because of that, you're getting to see some more exciting playoff games.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean that the playoffs this year were great. I mean that I was right where Bancaro caught that Hail Mary pass, and
Yeah,
I had pretty much set my camera down. I was like, oh, this game's over, and then I was like, oh no, and was able to get it, but that was great, and watching those two games and then seeing Bellevue. I was a little bit surprised that I guess surprised, not surprised that O'Day was able to handle them the way they did. And I think,
yeah,
kind of a testament to how good Eastside Catholic was that I mean, the first time Eastside Catholic and O'Day played each other, I've never seen two teams hit that hard. It was
sure.
loud. Yeah.
Yeah. And what's funny too is that O'Day loses their 4 year star running back in Jason Brown, who leaves as the school's all-time rushing leader. And the question is, who's going to be their running back this year? And Uriah Stringfield, who shows up to be a baseball player, who you don't look at and necessarily think this guy is going to be the guy at running back, goes and just has this incredible playoff run and what an incredible state championship. And that was, I think, one of the biggest surprises. O'Day loses Kai McDonald, who goes to Arizona State, is a plays on Arizona State as a true freshman. They lose Jason Brown. They lose Ascendre Afua, who goes to Texas A&M. You lose three, All-American type players, and you go undefeated the next year. And that was a pretty junior heavy class. So their run might not be over. And That's another thing about this state. Like you mentioned that Eastside Catholic O'Day game and how physical it was, and that Bellevue O'Day game. Besides the fact it was one of the quickest state championship games ever because they both want to run the ball, it was so physical. We saw that a couple of years ago when Yale won that first state title under Jason Ronquillo with Braden Platt and Isaiah Patterson. How physical this state is, and I think that Washington doesn't get the credit like a lot of other states do for just how physical the football is in this state. And I think that's because there's been such a resurgence on the offensive side of the ball. So we all think offense, but with the amount of defensive talent, we're seeing some physical games and a lot of big hitting. And, you're seeing some of these games where it's like you are on the sidelines watching, you're leaving sore from just watching all the violence.
Mhm. Yeah, no, that's it. That's yeah. It really is. It does seem a bit more intense than, even when even when I was there, which is saying something. One other thing that you reminded me, and we were talking about state titles or state championship games, is I got there early for the Bellevue game, and I'm like, is that Jason Gesser on the sideline? I thought that was crazy to see him, back on the field, and then I believe his son was the quarterback.
Yeah. And, it's funny because when 12 years ago when Jason Getzer was the head coach at Eastside Catholic, they were just kind of building to now where they are a perennial Final Four team. And I remember the old Jason Gesser camp that we used to have, and how you would have a couple of guys. It's so funny to now see Jason on that side of it as a high school coach, and with his son who used to see as a 5 year old at those camps running around and just having fun. Now you're watching them and means I'm old. But at the same time, like we're seeing a lot of these former players that played in this state. Carl Bonnell's son is the starting quarterback at Tahoma High School. You're seeing a lot of legacies, guys that were, we know who their dads were. We watched their dads or we watched older brothers, and now it's their time to shine. And so, yeah, it's crazy how football, and it's great having those games in Husky Stadium. It's awesome to have a venue like that because it also gives the state a goal. When you had those games at the Tacoma Dome, they always knew we want to be, the road to the dome. Then you had 3 years where they were off in the wilderness doing God knows what at these other stadiums. But now it's like it gives these kids something in August, in May when they're in spring ball, that focus. And then you kind of get all the stars out when you get some of these matchups that we got at the state championship games.
Mhm. One thing, we're running a little bit low on time, and I really appreciate it. I know you've got a ton going on, so I don't want to take up too much time. One of the things, every time I see you, and I don't think I've ever said this before, but I can't help but think back to a day at Husky Stadium, and you brought Avery out, and I took a picture. I was still very early in my photo days, but just like as a parent now, I think my heart still hurts a little bit, to know that to not even imagine what you've gone through. And every time I hear, that there's still things going on that honor her memory, I think that, like, I think about you. And, I guess not that you have to necessarily comment about that, but what is coming up, and how is it nice to keep her memory alive?
It's awesome. I mean, it's the thing that I'm the most proud of, that I get to continue to share her story and her legacy impacts. And one of the coolest parts about it is just this week, with the All-American Bowl on Saturday in San Antonio, a player got to announce his decision at that game, a young man from Canada. And he came to the very first Avery Strong showcase that we did at the University of Puget Sound in June of 2023 with no offers. 6'6" kid. So he looked the part, but he had no offers. And then he announced his decision over the weekend at the All American Bowl. And when I was talking to him before, he said, it's crazy. I came to the camp for your daughter and nobody knew. I just wanted to make a name for myself and was hoping that maybe I got like a Division III offer. Nevada offered him that camp. Cal offered him shortly after. And he eventually ended up with nearly 30 offers. And knowing that that camp being held in her name helped the kid realize a dream and open up a path for other kids from Canada to show they may have a chance to play at the next level. And so you've got the Avery Strong showcases, you've got the Bravery 7-on-7 tour, the Avery Strong tour, and these kids are coming to play football, and that's their focus. And I want it to be their focus. But then they're also helping our foundation give families that if they're ever told the news that we were, that there's nothing that can be done, there's now hope. And Seattle Children's Hospital is a hospital that we're supporting, and they're doing groundbreaking stuff internationally. People come from all over the world to get treated there. And while it sucks that we don't have Avery here, we know that her legacy lives on, and I get to continue to tell her story to all these football players. And I was talking with Connor Weddington, who was a star at Sumner High School, and on to Stanford, played in the NFL for a little while. He still has Avery Strong in his bio, and that was 10 years ago. And to see that she still impacts guys 10 years later, and players want to have Avery Strong shirts or wristbands or that, it's just so great to see that they want to continue to honor her and her legacy. And I get to take my passion project of our foundation and bring a football event to it, and to allow these kids to have an opportunity for a life-changing moment and maybe get a scholarship offer as a result of it. So it marries my passion with my job, and it really can impact a lot of these kids' lives.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, and again, I can't even imagine hearing you talk about that, and I can see the pride that you have in that, and that's amazing. And I also, it still has to, even years later, it still has to be kind of raw, right? Right?
Hmm.
Like,
Yeah, yeah. It's funny because she was diagnosed in 2015. She passed away in February 2016. So we're coming up on 9 years. But every year when I go to San Antonio, this picture pops up in my memory, and it was the only time during her entire cancer fight that I left. And she had gotten a good report from her doctor, so the doctor's like, "You can travel." So I went away, and she made me a little sign, and it was like, "I love you, Dad. I miss you," that my cousin wrote, but she was holding it, and it pops up in my memory every time I'm in San Antonio. And so it feels like it's yesterday that I got that, and yet it was 9 years ago. And it is very raw, and it does still hurt, but we've turned that hurt into something greater, to share her story, but to turn a sad story into one of hope for other families. And that's the thing that gives me the most pride now, is that when a doctor you donate her tumor to research for 9 years after the fact is saying some of our studies were still being impacted by what we studied from Avery, and that's helping us with our treatment. I mean, it just blows you away. It's like, I want to do something like that to change the world. And then I've got my little girl who is still 9 years after she passed away, helping impact the world. And that's exactly what, as a father, you want your children to be able to do.
mhm. Yeah, that's amazing. And yeah, I mean, as a parent, again, like I think that's it really is amazing. Yeah, I don't, I don't know what else to say other
No,
than,
I appreciate letting me talk about it, because that's really my favorite part, is getting to tell her story. That's what I want to keep doing.
and I know uh recruiting is, it can be a rough business.
Mhm.
It's not always, there's a lot of people who aren't necessarily looking out for the best interest of the kids, I think sometimes. And I've always appreciated that you have, in my opinion, always had the best interest of the kids at heart. And, I think that
Thank you.
that's how I think that's why you've continued to grow in the space, right? I mean, every time I'm like, man, I mean, I guess it has been more than 10 years, but we were kind of a couple kids, like
Yeah,
on the
yeah.
sidelines, and here we are, and now I see you on TV, and that's really cool. So, as I try to do this and do my own part to help some kids, I really appreciate you coming on and helping me along the way.
Absolutely. It's like a trip down memory lane. Thankfully we aren't having to do it up in the near rafters of the Tacoma Dome to do this.
Absolutely. Yeah, I will happily go there if I have to. If I never had to go there again, I would be totally fine.
Same with me.
Yeah, yeah. All right, well, have a great trip. I know you're traveling for a while, and let's connect soon.
Absolutely. I appreciate it, Mason.
All right, thanks. Take care.
You bet. Thanks.